All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have back Dr. Damon Wood. Damon, welcome.
Good to see you, Guy.
All right. Thanks for coming back here. So since 2009, Dr. Wood has worked for the state of California in forensic institutions, including Napa State Hospital and 4 California state prisons, where he provided treatment to the severely mentally ill, the severely behaviorally challenged, and the severely traumatized. In 2015, Dr. Wood was promoted to the mental health leadership team at Salinas Valley State Prison, where he led teams of clinicians to provide treatment in one of the state's most violent maximum security prisons. In this role and setting, Dr. Wood championed trauma-informed organizational support for the clinical staff that worked in such a stressful and difficult environment. In March of 2021, Dr. Wood separated from the state service to work in private practice. All right, got through that. Damon, great to have you back here. I really appreciate you coming back here in light of things that have been going on for you. Bring us up to speed. What's been going? Let me just throw out the big general question. What's been going on in your life?
Yeah, well, I decided to leave working for the prison system of California at the end of March of 2021 this year. So after working for the state of California for exactly 11 and a half years,
Wow.
I decided to separate from the state, and I did my civil service duty, served my time, as you will, and now I'm kind of looking at other options.
So first of all, working there for 11 years, you said?
11 and a half.
I mean, it just seems crazy. I mean, I've never worked in a prison. I did apply when I first got out of graduate school, but it's, I mean, come on. And where you worked, it's violent, it's intense. Mm-hmm. It's all of those things. How did you manage it?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, it's a massive system. It's one of the largest correctional systems in the world, and certainly in the country, with probably the federal system only being larger. And so there are multiple institutions throughout the state, and every prison is going to be different. And so many institutions are actually medium security. And those are pretty stable, relatively mellow places. And, you know, you'll have staff that will work at those institutions, and they can stay there for 10, 20 plus years. Mm. In some cases, they may have clients that, you know, inmates who have been sentenced to life sentences that they may work with for years or decades. And so it's a very stable job. It's a very stable position, and it can be really fulfilling. The last 5.5 years, I've worked at Salinas Valley State Prison, and it is one of the most difficult prisons in the state because it's such a high security setting. And so when you get into the maximum security, what in prison lingo is referred to as level 4, now you're dealing with a type of inmate that is much more kind of difficult to work with, both clinically, but also there's a lot more gaming behavior, instrumental behavior, where they may be trying to utilize mental health for some other purpose. And so that makes it a lot more difficult and a lot more stressful. And yes, there is actually incidences of violence. Sometimes staff can be the victims of that violence. And so staff are in those type of settings are continually exposed to secondary trauma and at times to primary trauma.
So walk us through, if you would, what, led up to you leaving.
Well, 2020 was just, a year for the books. It just was stressful in so many different domains with the pandemic. And CDCR really, I think, somewhat struggled with how to respond to the pandemic. And you're dealing with institutions that are very, inmates are held in confined spaces. We've probably seen on the news, last year there was a massive outbreak in San Quentin. Several institutions around the state had large outbreaks of COVID. Interestingly, the maximum security facilities were a little more protected from COVID because the physical structure of the buildings kind of allowed us to maybe protect the inmates a little bit more. Whereas in the lower security prisons where there's dormitory housing, where you may have like 20 guys in a large room, the pandemic could just spread really rapidly in those settings. And so some of the largest outbreaks in the prison system was actually in the low security institutions. But even still, we had some pretty good flare-ups. And it was stressful to try to work in that environment, not only for a number of different reasons. This is not entirely I can't be completely politically correct on this, because there were some politics, national politics, that got involved, where certain individuals and certain staff felt like they did not need to wear a mask because they didn't believe that the pandemic was really real. And so, the governor issued an order for all anyone working in a prison system had to be wearing a mask on site, on grounds. But that order was often not followed or enforced. And so as a supervisor, it was my job to make sure that my staff were all wearing their masks, and they were. They were very, very concerned about the health risks, not only to themselves, but to the inmate patients. But there were staff in other disciplines that either were very cavalier about adhering to the order or just flagrantly refused to adhere to it. And then their supervisors may not enforce it. So I was put in a difficult situation of having to kind of police people, so to speak, that were not under my direct supervision, or to, report up to the chain of command violations in the mask policy. And that created a lot of tension within the work setting. And so that was just another layer of stress for me that was difficult. And I'm a psychologist. I'm wanting to provide mental health treatment. I'm not necessarily wanting to police people to do the right thing.
Right. So you're working in this incredibly stressful environment as it is, and then you throw COVID right in there. Then you're worrying about that, having for your own safety and health. And then you've got this other layer of staff, your fellow staff members, some of whom maybe don't even believe that COVID is real, and some of whom are just ignoring the protocol to wear masks, and you're having to deal with that as well. Wow.
Yeah, that was really difficult. One day we had, I think it was 7 positive cases of inmates who had tested positive for COVID. And then the next day it jumped to 35. And this was back in September. And on that day, I had 2 clinicians who were in their 60s or 70s who basically threw in the towel, and they just said, I'm done. This isn't worth the risk. And that institution struggles so much just recruiting staff to work there, that anytime we lose someone, it's a real blow to the program and to the department. And so, to have really good staff just pretty much quit because they felt it was a really unsafe place to work, in combination with the growing numbers of positive cases. And also they too were seeing, a number of the different disciplines refusing to wear masks. It was really frustrating and discouraging to just sort of see good talent walk out the door.
Mm-hmm.
And as a supervisor, part of my job was to train and lead them, and to build a mental health program. And and then just to see all of that work kind of get washed away, so to speak. It kind of felt like I was building sandcastles with the tide coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, well, there goes another great clinician who I've worked with for the past 2 years, but it's just no longer an environment where where this individual feels it's safe.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't blame them.
Right. I just can't get over the fact that, you worked there for such a long time, and you seem so dedicated, and I know you're you were dedicated to get to this point, or get to the point where you're like, I got to throw in the towel. Were there did you have allies that you could go to and say, look, this is, I need some help here? Or was it just, this machine was just so big that there was no getting through and being able to turn it?
I think there was a little bit of both. I did have some allies that I could turn to kind of be able to vent some frustration, but that's all it was really venting. And I would get kind of validation with the understanding that we are all helpless to do anything about this massive leviathan of a system. And what you need to understand is that, CDCR is, there's a level of dysfunction, dare I say it, that goes all the way up to the highest levels of government. So we're talking about, a branch of or a department of the executive branch of the state of California that has basically, due to it's being heavily influenced by a federal appellate court due to a federal lawsuit that was brought against the state of California and CDCR, claiming that the inmates' constitutional rights were being violated due to a lack of appropriate mental health care. And so that lawsuit is referred to as Coleman. And it originates actually in the 1990s, and it's still ongoing. And so there's the Coleman Court Monitors. And so that's this team of individuals. They're mostly psychiatrists and some psychologists and social workers. And they've been appointed by the court to sort of monitor the department's efforts to adhere to the court order to have a compliant mental health system, right? And so they're supposed to kind of be the referees between the plaintiffs and the defendants, right? And so you have this federal court, but the federal court doesn't actually issue orders on how to manage. They just sort of have veto power. And so any proposal that the administrators of the mental health department have, in order to, they have to run it through the court for approval. But the administrators don't have access to the budget. That's the state legislature, right? So you literally have the state legislature, the executive branch, and the governor with his, with CDCR being part of that, and this federal court. And all three of them are kind of in this conflictual relationship / system where they're trying to fix the mental health system in the prison system, but it's a mess, right? So unfortunately, a lot of the decisions are not being made. A lot of the clinical decisions are not being made by clinicians. They're being made by attorneys. And so what the result of that is a lot of the energy and the effort that the clinical staff have to put in is really more geared towards documentation, doing things to hopefully reduce the liability of the state versus doing what may be good clinical care, right? So this is not like a trauma-informed clinical system. This is a liability mitigation system that's operating within a clinical environment. So let me give you a concrete example of what, because that's rather abstract, right? But let me give you a concrete example. So the treatment of someone with borderline personality disorder, right? When you have someone who has borderline personality disorder, it's not uncommon that you're going to encounter self-harming behaviors, right? Whether that's cutting or something like that. I know of no program that is dedicated to treating borderline personality disorder that requires that every time the patient or client cuts themselves, that you do an intensive suicide risk evaluation. And it's the same evaluation for every incident of self-harm, right? Talking about previous suicide attempts, historical suicide attempts, throughout the lifespan, most recent thoughts of suicide. And that's what we have to do in CDCR. Instead of addressing what's in front of us with regards to what is triggering this behavior, and let's see if we can, address that, we're required by policy to, or I should say they, because I'm no longer there, but to do this intensive suicide risk evaluation, even for something that's very superficial laceration on the forearm that has no threat of serious injury or death, and there was no obvious intent of serious injury or death, that this was a coping mechanism for stress. Right. Nevertheless, the clinician has to drop everything they're doing and focus on this suicide risk evaluation. And that's really more geared towards liability mitigation. That's not necessarily clinically informed. Right.
I mean, as an outsider, it seems hopeless. It seems so helpless in a sense. It seems like how do you provide adequate, effective, quote unquote, good care within that environment? How do you not get just depressed as a clinician? I mean, it seems like you're just constantly pushing up this boulder, up this hill.
Yeah, it's rather Sisyphean, isn't it? I wish I had an answer for you. Obviously, I left, so clearly I don't have the good answer. There is a certain amount, I think, of learned helplessness that the system sort of generates within the clinical staff, because we may have, as clinicians and the clinical training we get, we may have some really clear ideas or some creative ideas on how to approach something clinically, and yet we're not reinforced for that. That's not where the energy and attention is placed. It's much more on, is your documentation up to the standards that it needs to be, right? And that bar of compliance continually is pushed up, right? So there's kind of this sense that no matter how good your documentation is, it's never good enough, right? And so it is sad, because, and it was really frustrating as a supervisor, because I would love to have been involved in putting on some really interesting trainings about, what's happening in the field with regards to trauma what the neuroscience is showing, and polyvagal theory and these sorts of things, and really having some in-depth seminars or discussions on clinical topics. The trainings that we were giving had to do with, let's revisit this suicide risk evaluation, and how do we do it? How do we document it appropriately, right?
So are you saying you couldn't have offer those other trainings? There wasn't room for that?
Yeah, there just wasn't enough. There was no space to do that, because our time was so preoccupied with documentation compliance that we weren't really talking very much about actual clinical topics.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was no institutional discussion about countertransference. That was not, or parallel process. Like that was never, those kind of clinical topics were never really being discussed in the leadership meetings,
mm-hmm.
right? My team and I may have had some discussions of that, but that was much more organic.
Right.
What the system was pushing down, for what the system wanted us to really discuss was measurable, observable, results to this kind of evidence-based kind of practice with measurable results, goals that are measurable and observable, which there's some validity to that, but
right.
Everything with it, within reason.
What do you think what is, I guess, the message that you want people to hear who are listening to this?
Oh boy.
I mean, before you answer that, let me just say something to you. You've been on this podcast a few times, and you've always struck me as someone who cares deeply about the work and the people you work, the clients you work with, and the people who are working, your supervisees. You also struck me as someone who really cared about that. And you struck me as someone who really wanted to, like you said, bring to the table discussions and trainings about trauma-informed care, et cetera. And a few months ago when you left, or whatever it was, you sent out a letter. I was fortunate enough to read that letter, which was really a beautiful letter. And it really struck me. It struck me as the words written from someone who was in pain, in a sense, for a lot of different reasons, and that may or may not be true, but.
No, it was true. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm just curious about, because people who are going to be listening to this are going to be having, I guess, a lot of different thoughts, but what is it some of the things you'd like them to get from what you're sharing today?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, as I said before, the settings are very different depending on, which prison you're at. And some settings are very manageable, and those settings I think can be very fulfilling. The setting that I worked in was very fulfilling for a long time, even at a level 4, what's called high control, so it's not just level 4, but it's kind of level 4 plus, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of some of the most violent inmates, these are really disturbed men, and I'm specifically men. And yet, there was a sense, not only for me, but also for my staff, that, that we were making it, we could have an impact at times with people who really could use the help, they could use the treatment. Unfortunately, that impact many times felt like it was in spite of the system, not because of it. Mm-hmm. And so, I think for me personally, I became acutely aware that, um, the importance of leadership and how, not that I was, a perfect leader by any stretch of the imagination, but that it's possible to create an environment within that setting that feels, where the clinicians are feeling supported, so that they can do their job. I think it's really important as a clinician, if you're going to hold the space for someone who's in pain, then all the back office stuff needs to fade. That's not something that you want to also be worrying about when you're holding that container, right? And so, regardless of the setting, whether it's a prison setting, whether it's a state hospital, whether it's a group private practice, I think in order for the clinical staff to be most effective, it's really important that the leadership and the administrators are effective at their job so that the clinicians can really be present for that clinical encounter. And I think that's a challenge in any setting. I don't know that it's unique to the prison system.
Right.
I think I know of clinicians who are working in large hospital settings, where they don't feel like. Sorry, there's a phone in the background. I should have removed that. Well, okay. I know of clinicians working in large hospital settings where they struggle with feeling like the clinical encounter is really supported. Where instead you have kind of this managed care, and they can offer maybe 3 individual sessions and no more, because only group treatment is really what is provided under that system, right? So it is, I think, a dilemma for anyone in the industry, not just in the prison system.
So moving forward, so are you currently doing private practice or get into private practice? What's your status now?
Currently, I'm on sabbatical.
Okay.
The plan is to move in the direction of private practice. But I am taking some well-deserved time off.
I would imagine. Yeah, and of course you deserve it. And I'm curious about, what do you take into your private practice? And I'm sure there's so many different things, moving forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure how great a marketing strategy is to say, yeah, hey, I was really effective with those serial killers. That's a really good question. And it's actually one that I'm still sitting with. I don't know that I yet have formulated my own answer to that. So maybe we'll come back to that in a future podcast.
Right. But I appreciate what you just said about, even in that type of setting, prison setting, and working with, that type of client, someone who is maybe particularly violent, being able to keep all that back office stuff at bay, and not allow that to, seep into the containment and the clinical setting. That in and of itself seems like to me, a daunting task, but a really, I think, important goal, to be able to do.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I really learned is the importance of clinical teams and teamwork, and the real value of being a member of a high functioning team. And I know that some clinicians are working in private practice, and now, particularly in 2020 with COVID, most of their work was being done telehealth. And I think for many of them there was a real feeling of isolation. And so I, to some degree, worry for myself, like, am I going to feel isolated in private practice, having been a member of a team and leading teams? So I think that's something that, you know, we all should need to be aware of like how much do we need to be part of a larger group, whether it's a consultation group or something, so that we're not just, in our office seeing individual patients, clients day in
Right.
and day out and feeling like we're isolated.
Right.
Yeah, I was speaking to a clinician who used to work at the prison system, and this individual is now has a very successful private practice, but feels really isolated and misses working at the prison because of that clinical kind of camaraderie, that, and not just within the mental health staff, but also with other disciplines, with custody and psychiatry and nursing. And so there can be that is one of the benefits, I think, within the prison system, is that there can be this sense of like, we are all on the same team and we're looking out for each other, because there is this potential risk or danger. And it's kind of a basic group dynamic that some external threat kind of allows the group to cohere even stronger.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. And it speaks to oftentimes newer clinicians, when they're just starting out, they may think, I'd like to work with A, B, or C population, and not really think about, maybe not even realize how much they would get out of working with a team or even need a team. I worked in a couple of clinics. I loved being part of a team like that, just being able to, after seeing a client, not know what the heck was going on, just being able to go into someone else's office and sit down and go, oh my God, I don't know what's going on, and just shoot back and forth. Just have that camaraderie is crucial. But you strike me as someone who has a lot of experience, a lot to offer from this experience, and it'll be really interesting to see what you do, how that plays out. Will you become part of another team? Will you lead another team?
I'm curious to see that too, because I really do enjoy leading teams, and I really invested a lot of time and effort to try to learn that craft, because it is a skill set, and it's not an easy skill set either. It's and sometimes it's gut wrenching, but it's also can be incredibly rewarding. And so, as I look forward at the possibility of going into private practice, I notice that there is a part of me that misses the idea of being involved with a larger group and leading teams of people to create an environment where they feel really supported, so that they can go out and do the clinical work really effectively. So fortunately, I'm still in touch with some of the team members that I worked with, and it's the relationships, I think, that ultimately in our lives that many times give us some of the most meaning.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Damon, what's the best way for people to reach out to you? I know some people are going to want to contact you after hearing you. What's the best way for them to do that?
My professional email is damonwoodphd@gmail.com.
Okay.
So I do not yet have like a website or anything like that. Part of working in the prison system is you sort of intentionally avoid social media or some large internet presence, because you don't want, the shot caller of the prison gang looking you up on their cell phone in their cell. So
that makes sense. That makes
sense. So I've kept a very, very low profile. I feel, Twitter and Instagram and all of these things I've intentionally avoided. So.
All right. Well, look, I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your experience. I mean, that's what this podcast is about. And, like I said, I love having you on here because you have a breadth and wealth of experience, and being able to, articulate that is beautiful. So I just want to say thank you so much for doing it.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always good to see you and It's a pleasure for me to be able to chat with you.
All right, we'll keep in touch for the next iteration.
Okay, sounds
All
good.
right, take care.
You too.